Welcome back to Faith and Practice. This is the next part of our series in Biblical Theology where we explore the main storyline of the Bible. So last time we talked about Abraham, and this time we're going to be talking about Abraham's children, the other patriarchs. Now keep in mind what we're talking about here is the child that is going to bring salvation, the child that is going to crush the head of the serpent. And so the promise of salvation went to Adam, and it went to Abel, but since Abel was killed, it went to Seth, and through Seth's line to Noah, ultimately to Shem and to Abraham. And Abraham not having a child is a crisis situation because we were told that through his offspring, all families of the earth will experience a salvation. They will experience a blessing, which is the universal blessing, which is the opposite of the universal curse. And last time we learned that Abraham was counted righteous, which is sinless, because of his faith in the promises of God. And that's going to be a very important theme in the stories of Isaac and Jacob. There will be two really important principles that we're going to learn. And the number one is that faith in the promise of God is essential. And number two is that God doesn't judge according to human standards. Now, Abraham has the promise of God on his side that he's going to have a child. And the mistake that Abraham makes is he wavers in his faith. At least for some time, he doesn't trust the promise of God. And we see that in the surrogate motherhood of Hagar. So Sarah's too old to have a child, and Abraham wants to have a son. So that's the crisis situation. He has a promise that he's going to have a real son through Sarah specifically. And the lack of faith is exemplified in giving Hagar, a much younger woman, a higher chance to have a child, to Abraham and expecting to get a child through that instead of trusting in the promise of God. And in this context, this is symbolic of a fleshly effort. Paul picks this up in Galatians 4:21, and he connects what Abraham does here with works righteousness, with trying to to bring about the promises of God, to bring about salvation through your own effort. So it's a similar kind of thing that we do if we try to earn our salvation. That's what Paul says Abraham is doing here. He says that the son of Hagar is the son of the flesh, and the son of Sarah is the son of the promise. So it's trust in the promise of God that is the actual key to bringing about the salvation. And Ishmael is born, and he's Abraham's firstborn, so by human standards he should be the heir, but he's not the child of the promise because God doesn't look at the firstborn. He doesn't look by the human standard. That's another key takeaway right there. And in Genesis 21, against all odds, Isaac is born. He's the child of the promise. And in Genesis 22, we get a remarkable foreshadowing of the gospel. See, Isaac, who's the child of the promise, he's the child that will bring relief from the curse. He will crush the head of the serpent. He's the promised line. He's the one who will bless all nations. God goes to Abraham and says, you need to sacrifice Isaac. The child of the promise needs to die. And Abraham, in the ultimate act of obedience, takes Isaac and goes up the mountain. And his confidence in God is rooted in one statement. He says, God will provide for himself the lamb of substitute. He will provide for himself a sacrificial lamb. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. That's exactly who Jesus is. That's why we call Jesus the Lamb of God. He's the child of the promise, the descendant of Isaac, the descendant of Abraham, the descendant of Seth, and of Adam and of God, who brings relief from the curse. And he is the lamb that God provides as a substitute to take away the curse. But of course, long before God provides Jesus Christ, the ultimate sacrificial lamb, he provides in that moment a ram that's caught in a thicket nearby, and that is sacrificed. And that foreshadows the entire sacrificial system, where a temporary substitute lamb is offered in order to atone for the sin, in order to symbolize that future sacrifice of the promised child that will one day bring relief from the curse. And Isaac has two sons. They're Jacob and Esau. And according to the human law of primogeniture, which is that the first son, the oldest son, he's the guy, he's going to be the immediate descendant, he gets everything, that gets flipped. Even before they're born, God, in order to prove that it's his child of the promise, it's not Ishmael, it's Isaac, he says the older will serve the younger. And that's exactly what happens. And you have Jacob, and there's a number of stories there, but ultimately Jacob becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. He has 12 sons, and there's a lot that we could get into with the story of Joseph. Joseph is not strictly the child of the promise. He's not the immediate next in line, but there's a lot of great symbolism in the story of Joseph that sort of is a prefigurement of Christ that would be worth getting into in a different video. And the final point where the law of primogeniture gets reversed is we see Judah, who is not the oldest son. He's not the oldest of the 12, But in the blessing of Genesis 49, we get a prefigurement that he is once again the chosen child, the one that God has picked out and decided to bring his salvation through. And I'm going to read from Genesis 49, verses 8 and 10. Jacob is blessing his sons, and he says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. So that's his brothers. He'll be the preeminent one. And then it says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the nations. So for the first time, that concept of kingship is tied to the nations. And the critical point here is that the same line that's going to bring restoration from the curse, the same line that's going to bring a blessing for all the nations, is also going to bring a king over all the nations. That's it for today. Next time we're going to be talking about Exodus and the people of Israel and God's continued story with a specific people. Thanks for watching.